Memory is a certain attribute of neurons. There are many ways it can be stored, such as the shape of synapses, the location of synapses, and the density and characteristics of receptors within the synapses, among others. The lecture hall was quiet, with the occasional sound of pages being turned. Like countless butterflies stretching their wings, his steady voice echoed in the bright afternoon sunlight. Some students in the audience furrowed their brows, focusing intently, while others scribbled furiously, their pens chasing the shadows on their notebooks. The network is constantly changing, but not all changes lead to memory loss. The manifestation of memory is an initial stimulus, which can be internal, such as thinking of something, or external, such as seeing something, that triggers conscious activity. When the network structure gradually changes and reaches a certain threshold, the initial stimulus can no longer trigger large-scale cortical activity. At this point, we forget. On the podium, he pressed the remote control to switch the slide. He freed up one hand to flip through the notebook in front of him, his gaze scanning the entries. Sunlight slipped through the gaps in the curtains, gently caressing his temples. After a brief silence, a student in the back row stood up and asked loudly, "Teacher, is it true that fish only have a memory of 7 seconds? Laughter erupted, followed by a great deal of noise. But this was a serious class at the Research Institute, and the young man who asked the question quickly turned bright red. He paused, looked up, and saw the young, embarrassed face. He raised his hand to signal him to sit down, smiled slightly, and after a moment, replied slowly, "It seems everyone has heard this saying." There was a gentle smile in his tone. "Actually, many of you here know that this is quite a rumor." As early as 2002, Professor Johnson from the Department of Psychology at Stanford University led students in related experiments. The facts show that fish have memories that last much longer than 7 seconds, even up to 2 to 3 years. So, the idea that fish have only a 7-second memory and are never bored in their lifetime is just a fairy tale. He shifted his posture, and the sunlight suddenly slipped away from his face, casting his features into shadow. Silence, an eerie silence, lingered for a while before he continued. "Is a 7-second memory truly happy?" He smiled, his voice abruptly dropping lower, almost like a sigh. "How could it be?" The large lecture hall fell silent for 3 or 4 seconds, then whispers sprouted like weeds. Coming from all directions, the Research Institute's corridor was equipped with large floor-to-ceiling windows, bright and clean, with ample light. The marble tiles underfoot were cold and translucent, with the shadows of pothose plants winding and twisting on them. "Professor Anderson." He was called by his assistant and turned around. The young man leaned against the wall with one hand, leaning forward, trying to look relaxed and cheerful. "With you leaving, when can we collaborate again?" He lowered his head and smiled. "I don't know." Then, he looked up into the other's eyes and softly said, "Farewell." She woke up. The ceiling of the room was exquisitely designed, with layers of light diffusing softly. The wallpaper was a light yellow with dandelion patterns, creating a cozy atmosphere. Yet it felt unfamiliar. Where had she slept? Someone spoke beside her. "Jessica." She turned toward the source of the voice. A young man in a white shirt was sitting by her bedside, looking at her with a gentle voice. "Are you awake? Would you like some water?" Only then did she realize how thirsty she was. She completely forgot to be vigilant and drank the water in one go. She handed the cup back, and their eyes met. The unfamiliar face made her feel a bit awkward. She strained to search her memory, but it was all blank. The last bit of her composure forced her to speak to the man. "Hello." He paused, then smiled. "Hello." He looked at her with an unnaturally calm expression. She tried hard to think, but her head ached terribly, and she murmured, "Sorry, but I can't remember you." "Exactly. What's going on?" He gently pulled away her hand that was about to hit her head and emphasized, "Jessica, my name is John Anderson." His eyes were soft and full of kindness. "It's okay if you can't remember. You've been hurt." He pointed to her head. She understood roughly. She looked around blankly. "Sorry. Is this your home?" "It was ours. Once." "So, it was her ex-husband." "Sorry. We're divorced and yet I'm still here." she said. Feeling a bit embarrassed, John had an expression of wry amusement but remained gentle. He extended his hand to her. It's fine. Neither of us is married. How about some breakfast? Scrambled eggs, bacon sandwiches, and a glass of milk more than half full. The eggs were cooked just right, not a bit burnt, soft and yellow. And she ate with great contentment. As she lifted the glass of milk, she tasted something odd. She put the cup down suspiciously and frowned. John noticed and quickly took it from her, handing her another untouched glass. He gently explained, "Sorry, you don't like cereal in your milk." She felt a pang of guilt, her gaze shifting around the table, noticing his hand resting on the dining table, the rolled-up sleeves of his shirt, his wristwatch. Why was his watch like that? A very thick scratch marred the dial. The glass cracked and twisted. He was actually wearing a watch that couldn't tell the time, yet the metal hands kept moving, jumping under the shattered dial. Tick-tock, tick-tock. So resilient. The sunlight was beautiful, with light blue curtains and an exquisite small window. A basil plant swayed gracefully on the windowsill. The dining room had a string of shell wind chimes, and the tablecloth had delicate lace patterns. As clean and fragrant as his shirt, she looked around and sincerely praised. "It's beautiful." He smiled and nodded. "Thank you. I decorated it all according to your tastes." She finished the last sip of milk. "John Anderson, so why did we get divorced?" He paused for a moment, then replied slowly. "We both had our own jobs to do. You had your dreams and career." She added, "So, it was I who wanted the divorce." John didn't speak, just lowering his head and smiling. She sighed, naturally looking up at the wall clock, 9:15. The sunlight was warm and the clean dining room seemed to melt. She was a bit surprised. "Didn't you say you were busy with work?" "I quit my job," he replied. "For me." Her guilt deepened. "I'm really sorry." "It's okay. Don't always apologize." He smiled at her in the sunlight, his smile like that of a cheerful young man, but his eyes like those of a laid-back elder. He had an unusual air of world-weariness, like aged paper cigarettes or newly uncorked vintage wine, as if the years had been ground and ground into this appearance. She couldn't help but blurt out, "How old are you?" She saw his smile slowly fade, his gaze deepening as if reminiscing about something. After a long while, he replied, 34. He calmly tidied up the dishes. "Jessica, the first time we met, you asked me the same thing." It was autumn. The dew was misty, with yellow ginkgo leaves soaking in puddles, layer upon layer. He was carrying a huge stack of documents, research reports, student files, lab record sheets, and nearly 116-page papers, which were quite heavy. He gritted his teeth and kept walking through the backyard. Unexpectedly, the autumn wind blew fiercely, swirling up from above and playing with the papers like flipping through a book, scattering them all over the place. He waited for a while, but the wind didn't stop and instead caused more papers to fly away. He had a bit of OCD tendencies, and he didn't want to put the papers on the ground, which was full of puddles. So he just stood there helplessly. Then Jessica, wearing a gray woolen trench coat, rushed out from the lab building. She came running, and upon seeing the flying papers, she first burst into laughter, then began to pick them up. She moved nimbly, catching the papers like birds, gathering them all into her arms. She wiped them with a napkin while chattering away in a bright and cheerful voice. "You interns are so lazy, with so many documents. Couldn't you make 2 trips? Didn't you know the backyard is a windy spot? I thought it was artificial snowfall. You just stood there like an idiot, enjoying the snow. You'd better let your sister help you. Or how are you going to explain to your mentor this afternoon?" After she had gathered them all, she slapped them heavily into his arms, making him shudder. Looking down, he saw her staring blankly at the name tag exposed on his chest. He had been silenced by her earlier outburst, his cheeks slightly flushed, and he awkwardly looked at her face. She looked up at him in disbelief, then at the name tag again. "Professor. There's such a young professor in the department." Her voice made him doubt himself a bit. She looked at him earnestly with her bright eyes. "How old are you?" Later, he found out that Jessica was different from other students. She was specially approved to participate in important research in the lab, A shining little son. He washed the dishes with a helpless smile on his face. Jessica, I'm older than you. She lowered her head. I was so rude. He laughed. And soapy water splashed. He quickly turned off the faucet. Isn't it because someone can put up with it? She felt a bit ashamed, leaning against the door frame, watching him. His long and strong arms moved up and down in the white foam. Gentle yet somewhat lonely, she murmured. So we don't have any children. His hand trembled, and he furrowed his brows. We did. We were going to have one. That was the detonator of their separation. The hospital smelled strongly of disinfectant. Through the glass door, she was lying on the hospital bed reading. Her face paled. He turned around and confronted the professors behind him, barely suppressing his anger. Professor Brown. Professor Green. How could Jessica, who's not feeling well, still be allowed into such a dangerous lab? The two highly respected professors, facing his questioning tone, explained in a humble manner. Professor Anderson, don't get upset. We're also very upset about this. We just didn't expect that Jessica, who seemed so energetic and lively, would actually. Seeing his expression getting worse, Professor Green quickly interrupted. Anyway, Professor Anderson, Jessica has always gotten along well with us in the lab. Her accident feels like something happened to our own daughter. We really feel terrible. Terrible. You're still young. And we'll definitely take better care of Jessica next time. He couldn't take it in. Not a bit. Another time. After 36 hours without sleep, his nerves on edge, standing in front of a high radiation source, almost drained of all his energy, was there going to be another time? He threw open the door and stormed in. The nurse had just changed Jessica's medicine and quietly slipped out. Jessica looked at him quietly, even offering a faint smile. John, you're here. He snatched the copy of Jane Eyre from her hands, and a page of experimental report analysis fell out. He was about to explode, taking several deep breaths. Jessica, at a time like this, can't you just let go of all this? Her eyes were clear, yet stubborn, clearly unwilling to compromise. He hated seeing her like this. As if nothing in the world mattered. She was 12 weeks pregnant and didn't even know it. Still working in a high radiation lab, which led to a miscarriage. What was left in her eyes? He threw the book to the ground, enunciating each word, cold and piercing. Jessica, think about it. What does that basin of bloody water taken out of the operating room mean? What do I mean? And what does your life mean? Her eyes suddenly filled with deep sorrow. She took several deep breaths and still spoke softly. John, you don't understand. Project Solar has been running for 8 years. And everyone has worked so hard. 3 years ago, Professor Lewis was infected and died last year. Vice Dean King died suddenly on the job. It's the meaning of all our lives. Project Solar is the most important human experiment I've been involved in from start to finish. An experiment soaked in blood. How many 8-year periods does one have in a lifetime? I'd be willing to give my life for it. She didn't finish her sentence because he lost his temper and lunged at her. The always gentle man was pushed to the edge. His composure and dignity shattered. But what broke the most was his heart. A small hope for a normal life. It was all an illusion. Jessica. You're too young. How can you compare 8 years to a lifetime? His hand pressed down hard on her shoulders, almost crushing her. His eyes cold through and through. Either you stay put, or we divorce. Who knew she would pull the needle out without hesitation, throw it on the rack with a crack, blood spilling all over her hand, as if she didn't even feel it. Today is the most important phase. John, it's life-threatening. I can't stay away. It turned out she had planned to go regardless of his words. The breakup was inevitable. And he was just the catalyst. He lifted her up and threw her back on the bed, her wound tugging and causing her to bite her teeth in pain. If she couldn't bear this, how could she bear going to the lab? He pressed his entire body down on hers, pinning her to the bed, his eyes bloodshot. There you go. She struggled and kicked recklessly, biting his arm so hard it bled. Several nurses burst in, screaming and trying to separate them. Are you crazy? Stop fighting. In fact, he had never hit her. She was the one hurting herself. With every cut and drop of blood, the young nurses couldn't pull him off. She broke down in his trembling, restraining embrace, giving up the struggle, and cried out, John, I'm the mother. Who could be in more pain than me? She listened, her heart pounding with fear, and patted her chest. My goodness. The female, scientific madwoman, almost unimaginable, stole a glance at him. John, I'm really sorry. He smiled. It's all in the past. Did Project Solar succeed in the end? He nodded. You just didn't see it. After you left the hospital, you brought up divorce. I was so disheartened that I drove you straight to the courthouse. He closed his eyes and pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose. If there's one thing I regret most in my life, it's signing that divorce agreement. He came back to his senses and continued. Actually, whether an experiment succeeds or fails doesn't depend solely on one person's involvement, even if it fails. It's largely because experiments have a certain randomness to them. They won't be moved by the effort people put into them. She suddenly felt a deep sense of agreement and nodded involuntarily. You're right. I was too young. I had a smooth journey and never encountered setbacks. So I became arrogant, thinking I could do anything. He looked at her, his eyes twinkling, and joked. I didn't expect that getting hurt would actually mature your mind. She felt a bit embarrassed by his words and subconsciously reached up to flick her bangs. Only to touch her smooth forehead directly, she froze. No bangs. Something roared through her mind. A loud, rumbling noise that she couldn't quite grasp. She suddenly remembered. The living room, the bedroom, the bathroom, white walls, neat and shiny tiles, and not a single mirror. Not only were there no mirrors, but there were no trophies, no glass ornaments on the TV cabinet, bookshelf, or in the attic. Why should there be trophies? She didn't know. She couldn't remember. The living room was also filled with green plants, all planted in aluminum cans cut from soda cans, with edges carefully wrapped in layers of tape by him. John Anderson, there are no mirrors, she muttered, her face falling. I need to see myself. He paused for a moment, then began searching through the drawers, saying, I was the one who removed the mirrors. I didn't want to see my own face. It's quite funny, isn't it? People think that by not looking in the mirror, they won't age or decay. Finally, he found a phone and turned on the front camera for her. It was the best he could do. She waited eagerly, subconsciously feeling that she was a beautiful woman. But when she saw her face, she was startled. Pale and gaunt jaw, tight muscles on her face, red eye sockets. She looked like skin and bones. She threw the phone back at him. Have I always looked like this? His eyes flickered with sorrow. And he quickly said, no, it's because you were in a coma after the accident and had to be on 4 drips. Your body was too depleted. She nodded vigorously and immediately stood up. Then let's go have lunch. We need to make up for it. He laughed speechlessly and pulled her back to sit on the sofa. It's too early. Look at the clock. She leaned weakly against him. John Anderson said, do you want to watch a movie? We'll go after. She nodded. What do you want to watch? Roman Holiday. She replied without hesitation, her voice dry. Why did she remember Roman Holiday? John Anderson smiled, got up, and squatted in front of the TV cabinet to search. Your preferences haven't changed. You still like watching such old movies. He opened the DVD player and inserted the disc, pausing for a moment. It turned out you were like this, but you lost patience when it was time to really watch. Later, I realized that you didn't really like watching movies. You just wanted to tease me and then lean on me for a while. She watched him, his back to her, squatting and searching for the disc. His thin shirt was taut across his back, revealing a faint scar. Sunlight shone on his hair tips, making them dark and shiny. The air was filled with a clean, fragrant scent. His movements were slow, and his voice was deep. She looked at her own fuzzy bunny slippers, and tears suddenly welled up in her eyes. For no apparent reason, she had forgotten her lover. And yet, so easily, she regained happiness. John Anderson pressed the remote control, walked over, and skillfully wrapped her in his arms. Leaning against the sofa, the black and white screen showed Audrey Hepburn in the prime of her life, lifting her skirt and chasing happiness, like all the noble princesses living in fairy tales. But all she wanted to do was cry. John Anderson was right. She wasn't truly interested in watching the movie, so she dozed off halfway through. It was he who woke her up. Jessica. It's about time for lunch. Ready to eat. She instinctively reached for her bangs again, only to find nothing there. He asked for her opinion. What would you like to eat? Without a moment's hesitation, she replied, camphor tea duck. He stood there, taken aback for a moment, then burst into laughter. A carefree and joyful laugh. All right, camphor tea duck it is. He turned back to the bedroom, tied his tie, put on his coat, and brought her a trench coat. She watched as he skillfully wrapped a light blue scarf around her neck with his long, slender fingers. She frowned. Ugly. His hand trembled slightly, and she could sense the surprise in his eyes. He quickly turned and walked briskly to the wardrobe, almost in 3 strides, and accurately retrieved the charcoal gray scarf she preferred. She was satisfied and obediently put it on. Her eyes filled with approval. He stood still, looking at her, and asked, "You didn't like the blue one just now?" She paused, tidying her collar and tugging at the charcoal tassel, and retorted, "This piece of clothing has always gone with this color, hasn't it?" He said nothing, took her hand, and led her out the door, his eyes a little moist. Camphor tea duck. 1 piece, 2 pieces, 3 pieces. He handed her the tea and gently advised, "You can't be picky, Jessica." She picked a piece for him, matter-of-factly saying, "You should eat more. Look at how thin you are, you're all bones." Always deflecting the topic. That year, the young and vibrant Jessica sat across from him, skillfully wielding her chopsticks, and under his astonished gaze, she focused on the plate of camphor tea duck, quickly consuming more than half of it. He hesitated. "Jessica, is it okay to eat like this?" She looked up in surprise, slowly took out a napkin, wiped her greasy lips, and said, "Let me tell you something, John Anderson. Never underestimate a Southern woman's ability to eat duck. Among my uncles and aunts, nieces and younger sisters, whoever can't finish a whole duck would be laughed at." He laughed uncontrollably. "You're making that up." She glared back. "Why would I lie? You know, I had a nickname when I was little." "What was it?" "My dad and mom called me the Duck's Assassin." Such a Jessica. He had thought that those little details would gradually fade and disappear from his memory. He thought he had long forgotten many things from their past together. But he didn't expect that so many things, in these long and trying days, kept reappearing, even becoming sharper and clearer like a photo that had been enhanced. Sharp enough to hurt. He was an expert in this field, having made countless theoretical contributions, attended numerous reports of new findings, and conducted many astonishing experiments. But he had never had such a profound and clear understanding of human memory as he did this time. It seemed that it was not just she who was struggling to find her memories. Everyone, including the whole world, lived in the glory of history. Devoutly praying under the sound of bells, she heard John Anderson, in his mild tone, seriously say to her, "Jessica, you know, you had a nickname called the Duck's Assassin." She choked on her tea. Such a straightforward name. Only my parents could come up with that. "Have you been making fun of me a lot?" "Stop laughing." He quickly stuffed a piece of duck into her mouth. A few waitresses glanced over, whispering to each other with knowing looks. She straightened her neck, feeling proud and pleased, walking in the small park. The sunlight shone on the greenery. Little boys and girls carrying sand buckets and small shovels wobbled and ran past them. John Anderson held her hand, and she sighed. "Is it like this every day? Like being in love?" He must have been smiling silently. "Yes, you can do whatever you want." She tilted her head, wanting to ask about his watch, but then she saw a row of swings beside her. The iron chains sparkled in the sunlight, swinging back and forth, tugging at her heartstrings. He led her over. "Come on, I'll give you a push." She quickly shook her head and turned away. "How childish." He looked into her eyes and curved his lips. "All right, Jessica, you always say one thing but mean another. If you really didn't like it, you'd say no just like you did with that scarf." She laughed out loud. "Professor Anderson, you really have me figured out." He didn't push her hard. She just swung gently. She saw in the distance, on a small sand dune, a sandcastle built by 2 children collapse. The children screamed and cried in turns. Their mother came over, gently brushed the dirt off the little overalls, and whispered comforting words. If She gently touched her flat stomach, lost in thought. Had there really been a child there? She stopped swinging and looked up at John Anderson. John. The first one to get a haircut in a few days. She saw him snap out of his daze and he gently agreed. Okay. He drove her back downstairs. The backyard was filled with many trees, pine and sycamore. Low shrubs spread out, emitting the subtle fragrance of plants. The grass was lush. And surprisingly, there was a small stone table and 2 rocking chairs in the grass. My goodness, she exclaimed. Did you do this? He looked at her eyes calmly. Boss Jing gave the instructions, I just did the labor. They laughed together. She sat on the rocking chair, feeling around. I can't believe I'm so young and already know how to enjoy life. After a while, he spoke. I think it's great. I was planning to live here until I'm old. She didn't know what to say, but fortunately, he turned and went back inside, bringing her a novel and some room-temperature orange juice. He was also reading. The tall sycamore tree cast a small shadow on his face, and his expression was calm, showing no sorrow or joy. She didn't want to read, she just watched him. What are you reading? He showed her the cover, something about brain neurons, professional material. John, do you think I was a scientist before? Her voice was soft, with a touch of dew-like coolness. He looked at her quietly. Yes, you were a very talented person in the scientific community. A rising star with unlimited potential. He suddenly pulled his chair closer and said to her, Jessica, let me read it to you. In the slightly intoxicated afternoon, the grass emitted the unique scent of plants. The rocking chair swayed gently, and his voice was deep and mellow. The cell bodies of somatic sensory and visceral sensory fibers are mostly pseudounipolar neurons, which gather into ganglia outside the brain, such as the V trigeminal ganglion, 7 geniculate ganglion, and the upper and lower ganglia of 9 and X. Their nature is the same as that of spinal ganglia. The 8 vestibular ganglion and bipolar neurons are formed by the aggregation of bipolar neuron cell bodies. She frowned. Cochlear ganglion. He snapped out of his daze, staring at the page for a long while before saying, Yes, cochlear ganglion. Sorry, I skipped a line. She looked at his face. The slight dark circles under his eyes. He was just too tired, lost in thought. How many nights had he not slept well? He looked at her in surprise. You remember? She felt a bit proud. I remembered some when I looked at the book. He shook his head, smiling helplessly, his smile weary. Just like before. You can't remember people, but you can remember experiments. Work is really more important. She took the book and naturally said to him, I'll do the dishes this afternoon. John, let me read to you. Her voice was soft and gentle, like cotton candy, like the best lullaby. He propped his head up and fell asleep. She closed the book and tiptoed closer to him. This man was always smiling, gently, kindly, and composed, hiding all his sorrow and fatigue inside, with no trace on the outside. His eyes were pitch black, like swirling galaxies, slowly yet powerfully stirring some emotions, but stubbornly keeping them hidden. She couldn't help but place her hand on his brow bone. He jolted awake and blurted out, Jessica. Light sleep, unable to rest peacefully. She sighed inwardly. John, daring to sleep in my class. How bold of you. He smiled. Yes, Teacher Jessica. I won't do it again. She sat back on the rocking chair and adjusted to a comfortable position. As punishment, close the book. I'm going to ask you some questions. He obediently put down the book, his eyes twinkling. First question. What is the largest thing in the world? He really thought about it for a long time, hesitantly answering. The Milky Way, and extragalactic systems. She kept a straight face. Wrong. Haven't you heard that song? Wife is the greatest. Yes, he said with a smile, even nodding earnestly. Second question. What is different about brain neurons compared to other cells? The functional body. Highly differentiated. Wrong. How can you not know such a simple question? Brain neurons are right here. She tapped her head. He laughed, his voice low, his expression surprised and relaxed. She suddenly felt a pang of heartache. Third question. She hesitated for a moment. This time, answer seriously. Okay. He nodded in agreement. Do you have someone you like? He thought for a moment, carefully choosing his words. I really like my ex-wife. She closed the book. Why is that? John. After our divorce. Haven't you met any other girls? He shook his head. His eyes filled with complex emotions. Jessica. You don't know. Your injury happened on our way back from the courthouse. In a trance, she asked, Can I hug you? He walked over and pulled her into his arms. She was suddenly overwhelmed with emotion and her voice cracked with tears. John. I really want to be with you forever. His body stiffened for a moment. And after a long while, he said, There are too many mosquitoes. Let's go back inside. She watched him bustling in the kitchen, the exhaust fan roaring loudly as he took out a plate of beautifully cooked green beans. She shouted at him, John, that's amazing. Ha! He couldn't hear her over the noise and turned off the exhaust fan. What? Never mind. She walked in. I'll help you. He pulled her away from the cutting board. Be careful of the knife. He stir-fried mushrooms, the aroma filling the air. He focused on the wok, holding her sleeve with one hand to keep her from wandering. John, the courthouse is closed now, right? She suddenly asked. Yeah, it's almost 7. He replied, her voice was timid. So, can we go and get remarried first thing tomorrow? Tomorrow. She saw him standing there lost in thought until the oil in the pan suddenly boiled over, sizzling loudly. She jumped in fright. John, it's burning. The air was filled with the smell of burnt food. He apologized to her, quickly cleaning up the mess, and smiled at her. Jessica. It's too smoky in here. Wait outside. Her heart sank. Dinner was eaten in silence. She looked around and noticed a TV on the cabinet, facing the dining area. She wanted to ask him about it, but she was still angry with him and didn't want to talk to him. He kept serving her more food. Jessica, you see how you look. You can't be picky. She quickly finished her meal and slammed her bowl on the table. John, do you not want to get remarried to me? No, He showed that dazed look again. She seemed to suddenly come to her senses and apologized to him. I'm sorry. I don't know what came over me. It's strange, right? It feels like we've only known each other for a day. And yet I'm clinging to you. Maybe something really did happen that you can't tell me because you're afraid it might upset me. I shouldn't be making a scene like this. He immediately put down his bowl and hugged her. No, Jessica. John Anderson, will only ever have one wife. It's just that tomorrow, you might not want to get remarried to me. What did that mean? His hands were trembling slightly. As if he was trying to restrain something, she needed to calm down. She pushed him away. I'm going to take a shower. The hot water slid over her skin, the temperature just right, warming every pore. In the steamy mist, her mind raced with countless thoughts. She craved the warmth of human connection. She had felt like a wandering spirit before. Not knowing where she belonged, she knew her accusations and complaints would cut into him like knives. She didn't want to do that. Couldn't he just smile more? Like he did in the afternoon. The pain and world weariness in his eyes were something she didn't want to touch. They were together. But this man seemed to belong to her and yet not belong to her. Belonging to her past self but not her present self. After all, her memory was a complete blank. Her emotions would soar one moment and plummet the next. The shower head sprayed hot water, which flowed down her black hair and neck. What if there really was some irresistible force that meant they had to be apart? What then? There was nothing she could do. She sighed inwardly. She was the one who wanted the divorce. She was the one who lost the baby. He was still taking care of her without holding a grudge. She owed him so much. Pushing open the bathroom door, she wrapped her bathrobe tightly around herself and stepped out, shivering slightly. The room was warm. He had turned on the air conditioner, which was blowing hot air. With all the windows and doors closed, he was sitting on the bed, holding a laptop, with several DVDs scattered around him, fiddling with a memory card. What's this? She asked curiously as she approached. He looked up at her and smiled. A gift. A daily gift. She walked over and snapped the laptop shut. He looked at her, puzzled. Her face was flushed from the steam. John, let's go to bed. She huffed. Don't play dumb. He came over and hugged her. She wrapped his arm around her waist, her face and neck turning red, even her ears burning. His expression was beyond astonished. It was sheer shock. She felt a secret satisfaction. This man had been so composed all day. And finally, he was showing a different emotion. Jessica. You. She raised her eyebrows. You said it yourself. We're both unmarried. Let's just treat it like a fling. Okay. She watched as he dressed, buttoning his shirt, then got up to water the plants in the room. First that he turned and saw her face, quickly rushing over to tuck her exposed arms back under the covers. Before lying down beside her, lying on their sides, they looked into each other's faces. Her eyes were bright. We've only been dating for a day, and I've already surrendered. Am I silly? He tousled her hair and suddenly laughed with a sense of relief. He paused, then whispered, Jessica. This afternoon you asked me so many questions. I want to ask you one too. Will you answer me seriously? She nodded eagerly. He said, some people say that fish have a memory of only 7 seconds. If you were a fish, would you feel happy? She said quietly. If I've already forgotten, how can I judge whether I'm happy or not? His eyes were a little moist. He suddenly sat up and brought over the laptop. I'll show you. These gifts from the past few days. Opening the document, there were countless files. Loading all the way to the very bottom, he clicked on the first one. It was a video recorded with a DV. The screen showed a light gray leather sofa, woven cushions, and light blue curtains. This was his home. Their home. There were sounds of disordered footsteps. John Anderson was supporting a woman, staggering as they moved. The woman's head was wrapped in layers of gauze, her face pale and her gaze vacant. That was her. He helped her sit on the sofa, then turned to pour some water. Jessica, just sit for a moment. Don't be afraid. Here, have some. Her face suddenly contorted, and she began to scream hysterically. She threw the glass of water he handed her to the ground. Crash, glass shattered everywhere. He quickly grabbed her shoulders. Jessica, Jessica. She screamed like a madwoman, struggling desperately and pushing him away. His expression changed. He struggled to get up. Jessica, don't run around. You can't step on the glass. She had already taken 2 or 3 steps, her voice hoarse from shouting, her feet bleeding. He picked her up and carried her back to the sofa. She kicked and punched him, her eyes bloodshot like a wild animal's. He took a syringe from his jacket pocket. His hands were shaking badly as he pressed her onto the sofa with half his body. She hit and kicked him, biting his shoulder. Soon blood soaked through his shirt. He gritted his teeth, just whispering to calm her down, restraining her arms and trembling as he injected the medicine into her vein. In a short while, she went limp. He sat on the sofa for a moment, then put down the syringe and carried her back to the bedroom. After that, he returned to the living room and silently lit a cigarette. This was the first time she had seen him smoke. A small patch on his shoulder was soaked with blood, his hand still shaking unconsciously. The cigarette's flame flickered on and off, and his profile, enveloped in great pain, seemed somewhat desolate. He smoked 2 cigarettes in a row, then fumbled for his phone and got up to make a call. Xiao Lu. Yes. It's not good. He slightly lowered his eyes. I'm thinking, can we use a different medicine? Always using Valium. The side effects are too strong. This isn't a solution. Then he walked over, unfazed, stepped on the broken glass on the floor, and turned off the DV. She was speechless. The computer had already started to automatically play the next file. Almost the same plot, screaming, kicking, no communication, and finally having to inject a sedative. Impossible. The next file. The one after that. Her hands were already sweating. It was always screaming, her own frantic screams lingering in her mind, refusing to fade. After watching more than 40 videos, the bandages on her head had been removed, and a large patch of her hair was gone, making her look like a terrifying pigeon. She saw herself sitting on the sofa, calmly taking the water he handed her. She let out a sigh of relief. However, the her in the video suddenly changed. She nervously muttered, "Who are you?" She stood up and pushed him, who was unprepared, to the ground. A sharp grinding sound. Only then did she see that in front of the sofa, there was a glass coffee table. His watch scraped harshly against the edge of the table, producing an ear-piercing noise. So that was it. He struggled to get up, But she did the same thing again. Her eyes filled with bloodshot veins. Who are you? Who are you really? The DV footage shook as she pushed him forcefully onto the coffee table. The table was pushed away, and his back hit the corner of the table hard. His face turned pale from the pain. A glass trophy on the table. Yes, that was the trophy. Her award for best scientific research. Rolled off and shattered on the ground. Someone burst through the door. A man opened the door, looked at the scene in shock, and rushed in to help him up. There was a red stain on his back. He winced from the pain, looked around, and found her in the corner, trembling and holding her head. He gasped. Lou, keep an eye on her. Don't let her run out. Professor. The young man's brows furrowed. John, this isn't working. None of us think it's working. We should send her to a sanatorium or the research institute. You can't handle this alone. He turned to his assistant, his voice soft yet cold. So your solution is to have the keys to my house. You. The assistant's anger flared. John. After all these years, don't you trust me? We're all doing this for your own good. If I hadn't come, what if you had died here one day? He realized his mistake and stopped abruptly. I'm sorry. He even let out a soft laugh, took out a cigarette, and lit it. Despair enveloped him. Of course I trust you, but I've already resigned. Don't forget, Jessica hasn't resigned yet. You've left the research institute, but she's still part of the lab. The institute has an obligation to help you. Besides, your method isn't working. He was silent for a moment, then whispered. I said I have a way. And I want to try it. The sanatorium is for people with mental disorders, schizophrenia, lunatics. Jessica isn't a lunatic, she just has a memory problem. This is indeed a memory issue. The assistant sneered. But can you solve it? The director has been working for nearly 60 years and has never seen such a case. He's even consulted with international organizations. There are fewer than 100 cases globally, and the top doctors are at a loss. He took a sharp drag on his cigarette, his eyes reddening. Why the hell did you two have to encounter this kind of bad luck? He blinked, his eyes dry and sore, and after a long while, he replied, Thank you, thank all of you, but I want to try. Further into the files, further on. She couldn't bear to watch anymore and had to skip through line by line. Her hair had gradually grown back, filling in the gap, and her face was no longer grotesque. There was no coffee table in front of the sofa anymore. It had been replaced with a rounded wooden coffee table. Glass items had been removed, and he had planted various small plants. They were sprouting and growing leaves in every corner of the frame. She sat on the sofa, holding the woven cushion in her arms, her eyes regaining some luster. But she huddled into a ball, fearfully watching John Anderson as he approached. Who are you? Who are you? She asked hesitantly, shrinking back continuously, tears streaming down her face. His steps halted, and he stood rigidly with his back to the camera. Jessica, Jessica. Tears welled up in her eyes as she kept murmuring, Where am I? Why can't I remember? Jessica. Little Jing. He walked over and squatted in front of her. Little Jing. Don't be afraid. Listen to me. Listen to me. Don't cry. Okay. He buried his head in her lap. He was crying. Why was the her in the footage always asking, Who are you? Why did she have no memory of herself in the recordings? Why were there about 500 recordings? Which meant, nearly 2 years. He reached the last one and clicked it open. The scene was bright. It was her from this very morning, behaving gracefully, speaking elegantly, and smiling brightly. Just like any normal woman. You see, it works, Jessica. His eyes were clear and soft, like a child's. I'm not very talented and undeservedly have a reputation for being promising. An intern doctor managed to save your life. But as an expert professor, I couldn't bring back your memory. I can't stand in front of the institute's lecture hall and talk theory anymore. If external stimuli aren't strong enough, people will forget. The only thing I could think of was to increase the frequency under limited intensity. One didn't know if it would work, and I'd never verified it before. It's just that I'm powerless when it comes to intensity. But I have a lifetime to try with frequency. Tears glistened in her eyes. John, my memory only lasts a day, right? He looked at her with such sorrow. She sniffed. How many days? 491 days. I've said, my name is John Anderson 491 times and had 491 passionate romances. He was actually smiling. His eyes moist, she was speechless for a long time. Is it worth it for you to treat me like this? How could it not be worth it? On the way back from the courthouse, he drove with a cold expression. And her head was leaning against the passenger window, lost in thought until she suddenly screamed. John! John! The car! In front. Only then did he see a van on the other side of the road swaying and lunging towards them, crossing the double yellow line and speeding straight at them. Its headlights flashing urgently like a silent scream. It was. There was no time. In the blink of an eye, a speeding dark figure blocked their view. Instinctively, he jerked the steering wheel, the sharp sound of brakes screeching. The driver's seat facing directly towards the direction of the oncoming dark figure. He closed his eyes, but in that split-second moment, Jessica suddenly unbuckled her seatbelt, lunged over, and hugged his head. The sharp ring scraped against his face. The cold hand slowly and gently released its grip, a warm stream following the familiar, lightly scented hair, winding and dripping onto his face. What she was truly willing to risk her life for might never have been the experiment. His voice choked. Jessica, we've actually never been apart. She hugged him tightly in silence. Her voice quiet. John, don't forget me. Okay, this is a day for Jessica and John. But it's a lifetime for today's Jessica and John. In the darkness, he rubbed her black hair vigorously. Jessica, you'll get better. I promise. Her tears flowed quietly down her face. She strained to keep her eyes wide open in the dark. If she just didn't sleep, would she not forget? Their breaths were tightly entwined. She fought desperately against sleep. But the night grabbed her hair and dragged her into a forest thick with thorns. The last thing she heard was her own voice, weakly echoing. John, listen to me. If a fish's memory really is only 7 seconds, then, as long as the person who loves her isn't sad, the fish doesn't really care whether it's happy or not. Goodbye. Jessica's John. Sunlight awakened her. She opened her eyes and saw the exquisite and luxurious ceiling above her, with layers of light, and the goose-yellow wallpaper adorned with small clusters of dandelions. How cozy. She silently appraised. Everything was so comfortable, just the right amount of sunlight. Soft lighting. She felt so relaxed that she didn't want to move. She heard someone speaking in a low voice on the phone. Yes, she's doing well. She remembers that she used to have bangs. Remembers her favorite clothes and scarves. Remembers the food she likes to eat. Remembers that she had a trophy once. Right. It was yesterday. She can recall some basic theories. Her thinking is basically normal, and her sensitivity is even higher than that of an average person. Yesterday. She tried hard to remember, but yesterday was a complete blank. Okay, thank you all. I'll arrange to bring her over in the next few days. After a while, footsteps approached, and she quickly lay still. Jessica, are you awake? The man who had been on the phone was calling out to her. His voice gentle. She turned her head to look at him, such a familiar face. Yet she couldn't place where she had seen him before. The sunlight was so bright. His shirt was clean and tidy, and he was holding a cup of just right lukewarm water. How could she have known that all this contentment was the result of hundreds, thousands of monotonous repetitions? She noticed his wristwatch. Hey, the dial was shattered, yet he still wore it. But the gold hands were still turning stubbornly. Click click, jumping resolutely, over and over, never stopping, even though it was already shattered into pieces, riddled with holes. That he handed her the cup of water, his smile gentle, his voice calm. Jessica, my name is John Anderson.